Order, order. Welcome to this session of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we are launching our follow-up inquiry on multilaterals, further to a report we did a few years ago. This is our chance to look at the multilateral system as it currently is. Is it working? What are its priorities? And what does the UK need to see more or less from it? We're really pleased to be joined this morning by Lord Malloch-Brown. If you could kindly introduce yourself, and then we will go into questions to you.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'm Mark Malloch-Brown, a member of the House of Lords, although currently on leave, but formerly a minister with, amongst other responsibilities, UN affairs during the last Labour government, and prior to that, UN Deputy Secretary General, and prior to that, Administrator of the UN Development Programme, and also at one point a Vice President at the World Bank. So, quite a wide perspective on multilateralism.
Perfect. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us. We see lots in the media, and I've said the words myself. Is it fair to describe the UN as facing a crisis of legitimacy at this time?
I think it is. I think it's a fair observation. I think you have to put it in a historical context, that it's not the first time, and I doubt it will be the last time. I think this crisis of legitimacy has particular features on this occasion, which is an apparent political bankruptcy in terms of its inability to secure cooperation even from all the permanent members of the Security Council. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a particularly extreme example of a so-called P5 member exhibiting the behaviors, frankly, of a rogue state. And so it's a challenging moment. But I think what I would say about the many times I've seen the UN legitimacy challenged is it's around primarily the wider geopolitics and the lack of collaboration there, which then translates into an apparent appearance of, ineffectiveness by the UN itself.
That's very helpful. And can I ask, when you talk about this crisis in particular, when in the past has the UN faced similar calls or questions about its legitimacy and its effectiveness?
Well, during the very long Cold War period, the UN was not effective at the Security Council level and was not heavily engaged in the major conflicts of the day, although it busied itself with, if you like, what might be called the second tier ones. And it also found a tremendous value to governments in both its involvement in development activities, particularly amongst the decolonizing states who lacked a lot of capacity, administrative and management capacity in their public sectors. And it had a first flowering of its humanitarian role, where the victims of the proxy wars of both the Cold War period and of the decolonization period, became the beneficiaries of very major early UN humanitarian operations. So the UN has been adept, even at times where its main political and security role has appeared blocked by geopolitics, in finding other important functions which the world couldn't handle other than multilaterally.
Thank you, Neil.
You suggest it's sort of cyclical, but doesn't? But then your reference to Russia sort of demonstrates the point. Isn't it more acute, the crisis this time, because of the focus on Ukraine and Gaza in particular?
I think that's a very fair point, and I think it is a very acute crisis, and one which has its own particularities. But and you're right to bring up Gaza as well, because in a sense, although the US role in the Security Council, has not been the wrecking role that Russia has sought to play on Ukraine, the fact is it has resisted the will of the rest of the Council on Gaza on repeated occasions in recent months. And so, there is a feeling that here are two major powers which really have not played ball in terms of respecting the rules of the Council. again, I would say we face the same situation in the Cold War. And when it comes to the Middle East, the US has had a very long history of vetoing resolutions which it has felt jeopardized the security or political status of Israel. So, these are not new problems, but you're right to say, sir, that they're particularly acute at the moment.
And it goes beyond the Security Council as well, doesn't it? Because I think for member states representatives who see Iran chairing a UN disarmament conference while supplying Russia with drones, and see China on a Human Rights Council despite abuses in Xinjiang and against both Hong Kong and those from Hong Kong who are now living in this country and elsewhere, the problems are more widespread than the Security Council.
They are, and let me be clear that this selection of chairmanship to these different committees, is a collective decision of member states, and there is a sort of Buggins' turn principle, which means that these roles rotate between different regions, and then within the region, there has been a sort of protocol or habit established that the region often has the major say in which of its number fills that chairing role. So, Iran and China, both influential in their immediate region, sometimes have roles which to the rest of us seem utterly perverse because of their record on human rights. And that is, a behavior, though, or a voting arrangement which goes back almost to the beginning of the UN's life. And at times it allows Europe to nominate human rights champions to jobs or to chairing roles which otherwise they might have difficulty securing. But the other side of that swing and roundabout is that it allows the absurdity, as you say, of a China or Iran on occasion playing these roles.
But what are the consequences for international diplomacy if governments and individual MPs of individual governments don't feel able to counter that perception that the UN lacks legitimacy because of those perverse processes that you're talking about?
Well, look, there's, first I'd have to say that, one man's legitimacy is another person's non-legitimacy, if I can put it that way. And, the UN is going through an interesting but difficult period of a sort of shifting sands of legitimacy. And what I mean by that is that, global South countries often have a very different perception of what constitutes legitimacy and what constitute values and a lack of double standards and consistency. So, for example, South Africa taking the case of Israel's intervention in Gaza to the International Court of Justice, has been viewed as extraordinarily sort of hypocritical by many in Western countries, but has been viewed by many countries in the global South as an overdue correction to a situation where institutions like the ICJ just were viewed as passively representing the will of Europe rather than these other regions. So, in a sense, some of the genius of the UN, it's a flawed genius, and you're right to point that out, is that it does allow countries that feel the system is weighted against them and dominated by the countries, the post-World War II victors, it does allow them through these different institutional mechanisms like the courts to make their point about a different, if you like, order of legitimacy.
Thank you.
Obviously, one recent example of the UN Security Council being perceived to lose its legitimacy, of course, is, and I think may become totemic for some young people in our country who may be engaging with the UN Security Council for the first time, is that obviously the UN Security Council did vote for a ceasefire over Ramadan. That was something that was passed. And yet there was little evidence of any effort to bring it into being, let alone enforce it. And indeed, we even saw the US saying it was non-binding. So what do you think examples like that, what message do you think it sends to younger people in our countries, but also more broadly about the UN Security Council's effectiveness?
Well, look, I think the tragedy of the events of October the 7th and then of the Israeli intervention in Gaza is, bringing a whole new generation of students in the US, where I currently am, and in Europe, into political activism, and on both sides of the argument. But and they look at this Security Council behavior with dismay. But again, I am veteran enough of these things to have seen, when I was Deputy Secretary General in 2006, Israel intervened in southern Lebanon, and there was again an effort to get a Security Council resolution to secure its withdrawal and disengagement. And for a considerable period, both the US administration of President Bush and at that time the UK administration of Tony Blair resisted that Security Council view because they wanted to give Israel time to complete its military operation. And there was equal, if on a smaller scale, frustration then. And I could go back through many other cycles of this as well, where in the Middle East there has been, as noted by the citizens of the Middle East, not just Palestinians, but Jordanians, Egyptians, Syrians, many others, an extraordinary inconsistency of position by Western countries. And that has really been on trial in recent months, where frustration with American foot dragging, on a resolution that clearly and unequivocally calls for a ceasefire, has been noticed across the Middle East and across the campuses of the US and Europe.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Chair. How have relations, in your view, changed between members of the Security Council since the invasion of Ukraine?
It's really broken down, a lot of the, if you like, friendships even that allowed the Security Council, often, despite very contrasting point of views, to still find ways to operate, particularly when it met privately or informally, to make sure that different processes, renewal of peacekeeping mandates, budgets, other things, that the work of the council continued. And this has put a great strain on that. Those who are involved in it on a daily basis claim that some minimum cooperation has remained, that key appointments like a humanitarian coordinator for Gaza have been able to get through even this divided council. But, working relations are, very strained, I think it would be fair to say.
What do you think the significance of all this is for democratic states versus autocratic states?
Well, I don't, I think, as you're all very well aware, we're, in the midst of a global, if you like, democratic recession. There's, less democracy in the world, according to Freedom House, his latest report, than at any point in 18 years, every year for 18 years, in fact, that their democracy indicators have declined. So, it's on all fronts a difficult moment for this remarkable system we call democracy. But I think in the UN itself, it's a mistake to just view it as a vehicle for democracies versus autocracies. Many Western allies, British, American allies, fall into that latter category. Egypt, for example, is a critical partner in trying to find a way through this Middle East morass, as is Qatar. Neither of them are real democracies. Qatar is a sheikhdom. Egypt has nominal elections, but no real democratic depth at all. And yet, they're vital allies. So, I think we have to be careful of not using that simple dividing line in how we look at the UN and its alliances.
I mean, the UN is as good as its component parts, and I wonder, from your experience, how you think improvement can return, because it's not a failure of what's going on in UN offices. It's a failure of states and how they now perceive the world and engage.
I think that point about it being a failure of states is critical, because I would, in a sense, slightly reverse your opening metaphor or change it to say the UN is no better than its member states. They're the ones who vote, and it's always hold up a mirror to the state of the world politics, and you see the state of the UN. When countries are fighting the UN with each other, the UN doesn't work very well, and nor do most of its constituent parts. But what I would say is, the UN has, as I said earlier, been quite good at, pragmatically finding the areas of opportunity where things can work a bit better. So, I'm speaking to you from Washington. I say how much I wish I could have been there in person, but in Washington, because it's the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, strangely, they're doing relatively well at the moment, because, a lot of countries, even though they're fighting on everything else, have a shared commitment to seeing global growth. It's vital for their own electorates or citizens. And so these two institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, enjoy a period of, relative political harmony. Last year, the IMF was able to increase its capital quota share by 50%, a massive jump in resources. And it did it because the Chinese were willing to collaborate and not insist on an increase in their shareholding, which would have led to an American veto. So, you do see on key issues collaboration, and again, if you look at climate change, it doesn't follow or track geopolitics. China is a big manufacturer of renewable energy technologies. It's one of the leaders in that sense on, improvements in the renewables regime. Doesn't stop it opening a lot of coal plants of its own, but it still wants to see internationally a energy transition. And, many Western countries, for different values-based reasons and the future of the planet, feel the same thing. And so, you are able to build alliances between enemies around specific issues. And I think we should always remember that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just very quickly, before I hand it over to Royston, are we being overly unfair on the UN, or are multilaterals across the board facing this crisis of legitimacy?
Well, look, I mean, first, I mentioned the Bretton Woods because formally they are part of the UN system. They're not recognized often as such, but, they are constitutionally cousins of the rest of the UN, if you like. And, so there are bits that work, and even, within the UN proper, the performance is, very uneven and different. And so, I think you'd be prudent not to sort of brand the whole system with a single grading. I think when you get to your report, you'll want to note the performance differences, across the system. And what I would just say is, precisely because the world is, in a very dangerous, troubled sort of era of rivalries, in some ways it does create this sort of space for multilateralism, because, people can't agree on much. a lot of what they can agree on tends to be in the multilateral sphere. And so, again, even amongst the gloom, there are these little sort of pockets of light that you can find.
That's really helpful. Thank you ever so much, Royston.
Are states starting to look for alternatives, minilaterals, outside of the accepted multilateral system that we're all familiar with?
A very good point, and I think yes, but I think the urge for minilateralism is a reflection that states recognize they can't solve problems alone, that bilateralism in a world of integrated economies, shared climate, shared public health, as we saw in the pandemic, in all these issues, shared migration movements, that around all these issues, you need collaboration between a range of states. And so, minilateralism is an imperfect multilateralism. It's the best you can do when, countries are struggling in the way they are. But I don't see it in that sense as a permanent alternative to multilateralism. It's a stepping stone to wider alliances of countries in many cases. And I also think that, minilateralism is not new either. I mean, NATO was minilateralism, and the fundamental purposes of NATO have rarely looked stronger than they do now. NATO mattered in the 1940s, and it matters today because the West faces a determined opponent in today's Russia again. And so, I think you're always going to see a mixture of minilateralism and multilateralism, but not a situation where one vanquishes the other.
And those minilaterals, are they for the most part values based, where there's unequivocal agreement on an issue, for example?
They can be, and I think I often feel that because they tend to be values based, they're a good starting point. So, for example, were you to want greater global cooperation on climate, a minilateral coalition of first movers might actually get a much tighter set of agreements than the vast, sprawling COP architecture, which has a huge number of, has all states and is condemned to move at the pace of the slowest mover because it manages around by consensus. If instead you had a breakaway group that said we're going to set some real standards, and countries that don't meet them are not going to trade with us, or they're going to trade at a tariff barrier to entry, which reflects the climate costs they're doing to the global climate. And then I think over time you'd see that values-based coalition of climate first movers expanding as others found the costs of exclusion too high. And so, they'd pay the membership price and become members of the club and transition their own economies to renewables as well. So I think there's sort of creative ways that values-based minilateralism can then, over time, morph into a more universal set of institutional arrangements.
Henry.
Lord Malloch-Brown, thank you for joining us today. How do you think countries like China, Russia, India, the United States, how do you think they are leveraging and potentially exploiting geopolitical tensions to gain influence in the United Nations?
Well, I think, in the case of China, it has invested a lot, and it made particular progress during the Trump administration years when the US was largely missing from the UN. And, in that period, China took advantage of the vacuum and put a lot more staff into the UN Secretariat, started trust funds available to the UN leadership to support their activities, and tied it to the use of Chinese staff. And so there was a real influence building campaign by China, which the US is now racing to try and block and tackle. I think in the case of Russia's, it's had its fair share, or it's had its share at least, of top jobs. But successive secretary generals have tried to keep those jobs at arm's length from, the really important levers of power in the organization. And so they've tended to be given the job of head of the office in Geneva or head of the office in Vienna, rather than highly significant political jobs in New York. And, because this is a long pattern, the Russians have always been a little bit the sort of petulant outsiders who've thrown bricks in through the window rather than sought to manage the system or influence the system from inside, as the Chinese have. And so they've adopted very different strategies in that sense.
And turning to two of those countries, China and the United States, how is the increasing competition between them having an effect on diplomacy within the United Nations?
It's having a significant effect. Again, the Chinese are, ultimately better players and are more respectful of the rules than, say, the Russians. But, a UN veteran like myself has always noticed that big powers, whatever their ideological orientation, tend to be less good UN rule keepers than smaller powers. The British, for example, in general, try to be respectful of the rules. A Nordic power or a small state like Singapore, despite not being particularly democratic at home, are very good UN players. And I think, there's an obvious long-term reason for this, that smaller powers need the community of the UN. They need to leverage their influence via the UN, and they count on the UN Charter for their own security, because they tend to have bigger, stronger neighbors who, they wouldn't do very well with if those neighbors sought to invade them. And so they are UN rule keepers. And as I say, Britain generally is, not always, but usually is a UN rule keeper. And in fact, I would argue, Britain and France both recognize that their claims to the 1945 P5 status and UN veto, that rights that come with that, depend long term on them being seen as good UN citizens. The US, again, as a big power, is much more capricious and much more of an a la carte approach to the UN menu. Being a good UN citizen when it's easy to be one, but being guilty of being somewhat partial about when that is, and that crosses administrations. It's not peculiar to Republican versus Democrat administrations. The US is, a big power that makes a humble UN official like myself tear his hair out on occasions, because, they are uneven in their acceptance of the club rules.
And just finally, if I may, talking about those developing and middle power states, how have their positions shifted in response to increasing multipolarity, and what do you think is driving that?
Well, look, you've had these two sort of short-term bookends of The Ukraine conflict, where a remarkable numbers, 135 approximately, depending which resolution, of member states in the General Assembly voted against the Russian invasion, and only a significant 30-odd abstained, and a very small handful early on, voted in support of Russia. You've seen almost the mirror opposite on General Assembly response to the Gaza conflict. And, it's because, there is a view of double standards amongst many developing countries. So, the early Ukraine votes represented a high watermark of Western renewed influence in the chamber because of Russian misbehavior and because of a more perceived multilateralist, return to a multilateralist and allies-led view of the world by the Biden administration. But, that has quickly reversed with Gaza. And, in that sense, what lies behind it, in some ways, unique and first moment in the UN when, there were long periods when you had East-West blocs and you had the so-called non-aligned movement, which was of southern post-colonial countries that combined to try and resist East and West influence, but did so in a way that, led them to voting as a bloc. The so-called Group of 77 plus China, as they were known and are known, that is breaking down. What's critical and I think important, and your question draws attention to it, about this new world is how many states who we link together under this lazy term Global South, actually want their own agency to make up their own minds about who their allies are. Let me just randomly take one such country, Kenya. Kenya, on the one hand, has volunteered, admittedly pressed by the US and the UK and others to do so, to provide peacekeepers for Haiti, an extraordinary act of international multilateral engagement. Yet at the same time, the new Kenyan President Ruto, is hosting Chinese delegations, American business delegations, Western delegations from all over the African continent, Turkish delegations, Latin American ones, Middle Eastern ones, because his economy is in a tight spot. He's an ambitious reformer and ambitious for Kenya, and he wants to pick and choose alliances and basically get countries to bid against each other for Kenya's support. So he wants money from China, he wants money from the West, and he's going to go out there and show leadership, in his case Haiti, but also on climate issues, where he's seized the leadership of Pan-African climate debates. And you're seeing more and more leaders in that mold who refuse to be neatly typecast as pro-China or pro-America or pro-Europe, but want to pick from different parts of the menu as fits their interest. And the UN, with its sort of multilateral platform, is a unique stage for them to be able to do that. They've had very good Kenyan ambassadors typically at the UN, and these individuals go out and glad hand across a range of ideological partners, as they do what they deem best for Kenya.
Thank you.
And it is interesting on that point around hypocrisy, because I think too often, because of accusations levied against our own country, we're perhaps cautious to call out hypocrisy also within, as you call it, a lazy term, the Global South. And I think actually when it came to Ukraine, there were many countries who refused to take a stance, to recognise the fact that a country had been invaded for a renewed time by Russia. But I do want to just quickly ask you before I turn to Graham, we do have a tendency when we talk about how the UN is being redesigned, reinterpreted, wiped out, changed the face of, however you want to describe it, in different countries of different ambitions. But we do focus on the big powers, the Russias and the Chinas. Are there smaller states where you see insidious actions that concern you, or others who may have they think it's an old world construction, they don't value it as much? Where else should we be looking for concerns?
Well, I think it's very important and a point. And, what I saw in the years that I served as deputy to Kofi Annan was we were dangerously sort of Africa-centered in our activities. We had many African peacekeeping operations. We had massive development efforts centered on the continent. And we saw other regions, feeling, frankly, a little bit neglected and, and therefore drifting away from the UN. And I felt that about Latin America, and I felt it about Asia. Asian countries were modernizing fast, their economies were growing very rapidly. They felt that institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, or a new generation of Chinese multilateral financial institutions, were a much better home for their ambitions than the UN, which seemed to be sort of overly focused on weak or failing states, or not regionally, geographically on Africa. So it wasn't so much that they were insidious underminers of the UN, but they just, were drifting away from it. And I think that remains a threat to this day, that they're just going to sort of think, well, what does the UN do for us? And conclude not that much. And so, I think the UN has to go on proving its value to all its different sets of stakeholders. Now, having said that, countries which are particularly smaller countries that are particularly bad UN behaviors include Venezuela, which you can find in the first rank of, hypocritical anti-Western votes whenever it can, but it's one of less than 10 states which comprise their most prominent, best-known members of Venezuela, Syria, Cuba, countries which just love to poke the American Uncle Sam in the eye and America's Western allies, and use any UN resolution they can to score points rather than to seriously stand up for UN values. But that small group of countries have been spoilers as long as I can remember, and I don't think there's that much difference between then and now. The big difference remains the one that I gave through the Kenyan example of a lot of countries seeking their own agency and determined to pursue their own path at the UN, and not anymore to just vote en bloc.
That's very helpful, Graham.
I think there is an almost complete consensus in this country and Europe generally that the world is now a more dangerous place than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And that, after all, is one of the main reasons for the existence of the UN, to try to avoid war. And we find at this time, when we're living in a more dangerous world, the UN is dysfunctional. Now, there are obviously two analyses that you can give of how to respond to that. One is, are reforms possible to make the UN more effective in promoting peace? Or what, in your opinion, would be the situation if the UN didn't exist?
So on the first, in general, big sort of set piece reforms that open up the Charter to a major rebalancing and revisiting of its principles, it is hard to imagine in such a geopolitically divided moment. And so, the calls that we will hear this year as the UN goes into its big summit of the future for a new San Francisco, for a root to branch reform of the institution, I think are unrealistic. But what's less noticed is that the sort of other side of the very conflicts which make it hard to do big reforms do allow small reforms, because you can occasionally build coalitions of countries who act for short-term reasons to try and embarrass the other side on a conflict, but in doing so set precedents which endure forever. Let me give you an example you may be aware of, but a very recent one. There had always been some limited opportunity, but it was very difficult to maneuver and achieve for General Assembly votes to follow a use of the veto in the Security Council. And the most famous early example was America using the General Assembly to authorize its intervention in Korea in the 1950s, because it was blocked by the Soviets in the Security Council. But it was a very complex mechanism, rarely used. In the aftermath of Russia using the veto over Ukraine, a very clever, long-serving UN ambassador from Liechtenstein, talk about small countries, worked to put up a resolution saying every time a Security Council P5 member uses a veto in the Security Council, the General Assembly must vote on that to confirm whether it's right or wrong. Now, that GA vote can't override the Security Council veto, but it's a source of great embarrassment, or potentially great embarrassment, for the country that has exercised the veto, Russia in the case of Ukraine, but already subsequently the US, which gleefully voted for this new mechanism because it was a way of poking the Russians in the eye, now finds itself on the other end of that stick come Gaza. So it's a small reform, but a significant one to allow the General Assembly to get its nose into the tent or under the tent on security matters. And so what I think you're going to see is a lot of those kinds of smaller reforms championed by different coalitions of countries. There won't therefore be the big San Francisco type redrawing of the UN, but I think you will see the steady drumbeat of attempts to make it work in a way which more legitimately represents the will of its members. To the point, would we be better off, or what would happen to the world if there wasn't a UN? I think for many small countries, the UN remains critical. They don't have embassies everywhere. They cover multiple countries from a single embassy. And the UN is both a critical place to carry out a more efficient multilateral diplomacy, but also through the UN's range of activities across everything from child rights to labor standards to the regulation of the international postal system to the management of international migration movements. There are a huge set of UN activities which not just smaller countries, but I think all countries would instantly feel the vacuum if the system just packed up and closed down one day.
Just a specific question about the World Health Organization. At a time when the UN is weak, the World Health Organization is trying to take more powers to itself with the pandemic treaty, pandemic agreement, where it is seeking powers to control the policies of individual countries if there is a pandemic of some sort. I mean, they have insulted all of us by having Mugabe as a good will ambassador. I mean, it seems extraordinary to me that discussion is going on to give over to an organisation in which China has undue influence the power to control health policies in member countries. What is your view of that?
Well, look, it's twofold. I mean, one, you mentioned Mugabe. Actually, it was a UN intervention by my boss, Kofi Annan, which finally got Mugabe to admit to the problem of the HIV/AIDS in his country and to stop treating it as, some disease for, in his mind, the sexually deviant, and instead allowed a decent public health response. He certainly wasn't going to do that because the Brits asked him. It needed a fellow African to make that demand of him for him to reluctantly concede it. So I think, it's not a one-way relationship here. On the China point, I think, and the WHO, let me tell you, as someone who managed earlier global pandemics, the problem was that China sat on critical health data, epidemiological data, which would have allowed an earlier start on, for example, the swine flu outbreak and, other earlier pandemics. And, WHO is, its problem has not been cooperation by Western states. It's been the likes of China not sharing data. So I think we should be careful what we wish for in denying China and denying WHO that right to demand pandemic data, because its argument is a very simple one, which is, a pandemic doesn't respect national borders. It's a threat to all of us. It's simply not right, whether it was, COVID or other outbreaks, that a China is able to hide behind the wall of national sovereignty to put all our healths at risk and jeopardy. And so, I if I may say, I think it's to misunderstand or misattribute the motive for what WHO is trying to do, to suggest it's allowing, China to influence or manage how the rest of us respond to public health. Quite the contrary. It's an effort to get China to be more compliant than historically it's been.
It's highly unrealistic, isn't it, to expect that China would open up its books. It's not opened up what was happening in its laboratories at the beginning of the COVID epidemic. It's highly unlikely, even with a treaty, that China, Russia, and other sort of authoritarian countries, if they didn't want to, would let a UN agency gather information that they didn't want them to have. It's much more likely that the democracies basically would allow people in. It would seem to me it would be a one-way street.
Look, there is a risk of that, but what I would say, and I think, the fact that those labs was a particularly acute threat to China's international reputation, because, if it was the case that that is where COVID came from, that was a massive, huge error, which had jeopardized world health and the lives of millions. China was scrambling to try and cover that up. And I agree with you. It, was in breach of all kinds of rules in doing that. But actually, what I saw very clearly was that while the absolutely remarkable American Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, which is the global leader in terms of health data, could never get data from China, China was willing to share it through the WHO. So when you ask the American public health authorities, do you need WHO? They always say absolutely yes, because we can't get the data directly. We need, an intermediary. And you should also know that the way the WHO is organized is it's an unusual organization, because it has very strong regional directors who are kind of like mini WHOs. And so the OHCHR WHO, actually does enjoy a relatively high degree of confidence from China.
Okay.
Just before we wrap up, Lord Malloch-Brown, apologies, we are running over slightly. What reforms do you think we need to see from the UN to protect it from autocratic capture and make it more capable of responding to the urgent needs that we see around the world at this time?
Well, look, I think we have to understand the UN is not a club of democracies. It is a universal chamber. And what democracies should do is organize within it to press for democratic values, but they can't expect a UN which, preferences them over, autocrats. The UN's got to be about is, the universal appliance in a consistent way of international rules which all its members subscribe to. And then, on issues like human rights, it's got to be, much stronger and more robust in calling a spade where countries fall short of its standards of human rights. So it's not about sort of slinging out the China's because of what they do. A UN without China, for example, would be a hobbled institution. If you want a club of democracies, have that, but recognize that's not the purpose of the UN. Its universality is what its power and authority and youthfulness to a country like Britain comes from. So I think, you again need to be careful about that. But second, I would just say I'm really glad that you've taken up this subject, because Britain does have a unique standing in the UN and unique opportunity in the UN. It is a P5 member for historic reasons. It has devoted itself over many decades to try and make the UN work better. And so it does have a particular authority and status to call for reforms. And I hope you will use that, to come up with thoughtful reforms. And I could give you a list, but I think you are out of time. So I'll save you the long list of reforms that a career UNer like me could easily provide you with.
Well, we hope that you will write to us with those, because we would very much like to receive them. We are very much focused on solutions rather than just pointing out the problems. So please do send those through. And with that, we say ever so much thank you to you, Lord Malloch-Brown. And with that, we will suspend order.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order. Welcome back to this hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we continue our hearings this afternoon on the multilateral system. We have two fabulous guests this afternoon. Emma, can you kindly introduce yourself?
My name's Emma Reilly. I worked at the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for 10 years. And while I was there, I discovered a number of favours rendered to the Chinese delegation, most notably the communication of the names of human rights activists, including British citizens, to China. No other state was accorded that favour.
Richard.
I am Richard Gowan, the United Nations Director for the International Crisis Group, a global conflict prevention organisation, and I have been covering the UN in various different capacities for 20 years.
Brilliant. Well, in this session, we're very keen to look at the lessons that need to be taken and how we get to a multilateral system that people can have confidence in, but also function successfully. But to kick us off, Richard, what would you say are the most significant problems currently facing the UN? Political problems, structural problems, whether it be funding, peacekeeping failures, failure to implement things like ceasefires, lack of leadership, failures within Secretariat. Where do the issues sit?
Well, all of those are problems, but I think that there are three fundamental challenges to the UN that underlie a lot of the more short-term problems. The first is the very tense state of major power relations, which is clearly doing great harm to the Security Council. And I think especially Russia now is adopting a very aggressive diplomatic posture in the Council that damages the UN as a whole. Secondly, there is a lack of trust between essentially Western countries, developed countries, and developing nations, because many developing nations believe that previous Western pledges on aid, but also on climate change adaptation, have not been fulfilled. And there's a huge amount of resentment around that. Although I would say that a majority of non-Western nations would still like to work with the UK and its allies to get global development back on track and deal with issues like debt. Finally, there is the fact that the UN is just not very relevant or well calibrated to deal with some of the big issues of the moment. The UN has a development system designed to fix the problems of the 1960s. It doesn't have agencies dealing with issues like artificial intelligence. And we're seeing, a huge period of scientific advance, and the UN is trailing behind that. And that does affect the organization's capacity to deal with global change.
Thank you. Emma, do you agree with that assessment and those three core areas of concerns? And also, from your experience, how does interference in autocratic states hamper the ability of UN agencies to deliver their remits, hamper their ability to reach agreements, and obviously implement them as well?
I agree largely with that. I think the UN is not fit for purpose, and I agree also with some of the points that Lord Malloch-Brown made about the crisis of confidence. Unfortunately, I think a large part of that crisis of confidence is quite justified. There's a tendency to focus on the sort of political level about getting these resolutions and agreements into place among member states. But then there's the implementation level, and most of the time it's the UN Secretariat itself or some part thereof that is sort of supposed to take this and make it work on the ground. And I think that really there's been a failure among member states to really look at what's happening in that part of the UN. And just to take a couple of very concrete examples, the UN's court position in my own case is that there is an absolute right for the UN as a body to lie to member states. Now, that's the equivalent of saying that the FCDO could lie to Lord Cameron. It's quite an extraordinary position to be taking, and it's not simply theoretical. This is something that is borne out in reality. So you have, for example, the man who ordered this policy of handing names to China is on the record in a sworn witness statement admitting that in order to cover the matter up, he lied to the UK delegation. Now, the head of management of the UN decided that he had not committed misconduct, but for reporting him, I had. And it plays out this kind of, what can seem like an internal issue then plays back into the political realm. So, for example, another person within the UN Secretariat who's responsible for all investigations ever conducted in the UN was caught by his own investigators on tape in 2018. He was giving them direct instructions that they should ignore mandated investigations on which they enjoyed no discretion, ordered by a resolution of the General Assembly when a whistleblower is involved. And he was very explicit about why he was doing that. He said, and I just want to quote him so I cannot be blamed for that gets the Americans off the UN's back, which means they don't reduce their contribution. So instead of having accountability and sort of following the procedures as his first priority per the investigations manual was the interests of the organisation. And this is the man that is currently responsible for the UNRWA investigation. Now, I do not claim to know what happened in UNRWA, but what I can tell you with absolute certainty is that a man that has already admitted to faking investigations to make sure that the US contribution to the UN coffers doesn't go down is relatively likely to find that it's bad apples in a context where his job, as he understands it, is to make sure that the US money starts flowing again. So I think that there's been a tendency to focus on, what's happening in the Security Council, what's happening in the General Assembly, are our political priorities being reflected in these resolutions, and much less attention on what's happening in the Secretariat, which is essentially left to its own devices because that's seen as below the sort of interest of diplomats.
Forgive me, Emma, who are the Secretariat accountable to?
And they are accountable to the Secretary General. I think I will be covering some of the Secretary General's influence on some of these issues later in my evidence, but the Secretary General in my own case was written to by the head of the Ethics Office, and the Secretary General is supposed to be the guarantor of the independence of the Ethics Office of the UN. She explicitly wrote to him saying that failure to investigate in my case would result in basically the evisceration of the UN whistleblower protection system, that nobody would have confidence in that system again if he didn't follow the rules. The Secretary General, having received that memo, went ahead and failed to respect the rules. So I don't think it's actually particularly useful to have as a purported guarantor of independence to whom all of these different allegedly independent agencies report, as a man who is prepared to ignore those rules if that is politically expedient for the UN as he sees it himself.
So on that point, so essentially to translate it into our system, Antonio Guterres is essentially the Director General or permanent secretary, is the permanent secretary of the UN Secretariat. Ministers in the UK would be able to rewrite some of the code, the civil service code if they wanted using the Cabinet Office, or they could change the way which civil servants work. Is it member states that act as that almost ministerial equivalent who would have to ask for a change in the code or the change in the accountability of the UN Secretariat? How would you begin to reform that?
It would actually be incredibly simple because the initial GA resolutions for all of those processes are already in place. What has happened is that they have this kind of internal ability to create legislation that's just created by the Secretary General. So, for example, in response to one of my cases, I managed to get a former High Commissioner placed under investigation. They didn't like that. It used to be that when there were reasonable grounds to believe that misconduct may have occurred and a report was made in good faith, there had to be an investigation. The Secretary General, within a month of the judgment coming down in my case, changed that rule so that now the primary concern is if the investigation is in the interests of the organisation, and you can no longer force investigation no matter how good your proof that misconduct has occurred. That was done without any influence from member states. It was done without even telling member states. In fact, that was sold to member states as, oh, look, we've improved the system, now NGOs can make a complaint. But the member states, including the UK, aren't really paying attention to that level of legislation. They see it as below their notice. It has been put back in the past. And basically what happened was the US delegation went to see the Secretary General and said, look, you're no longer in compliance with the outcome of the World's Summit of 2005 when we established all of these institutions. We required independence, we required transparency, we required all of these good things. The current legislation as it's written, as you have changed it, no longer respects that, so you need to change it back. And that's where particularly the UK and the other democratic states can play a role in terms of saying that we do expect the UN, when it's spending our taxpayer funds, to have at least the same kind of level, at least the minimum guarantees of transparency that we would expect for government funding anywhere else.
Well, Richard, can I bring you in on that? I mean, how easy is it for member states to come in and want to reform the UN Secretariat and the way it works? Is it an independent machine that thinks because it reports to so many masters that actually it's almost built up a kind of bolster to protect itself from the member states and thinks that it knows better?
I think that there is an advantage in having an independent international civil service, because one of the strengths of the UN is precisely that you should have officials who are not beholden to any state and who are attempting to promote international cooperation or standards on issues like human rights. The reality, of course, and Emma describes a very clear set of symptoms of this, is that you have an institution that is under constant political and financial pressure. And the Secretary General in particular is always under pressure from the major powers, for example, from China, over the Uyghur issue. Antonio Guterres has been especially unfortunate in that he's had to deal with first the Trump administration and then China and Russia during a very difficult period. So I think the more that member states can push for transparency, the more that they can push for the UN to follow the rules, the better. But I do think we need to be clear-eyed about the fact that this is always going to be an organization where big power politics bleed into the way that the organization works, and that leaves UN officials feeling very defensive and, yes, often very inclined to duck controversy.
That's very helpful. I'm going to go down, but I'm sure Henry will want to bring us back, because I think a point you'd naturally want to call on there is the idea that the Secretariat are truly country agnostic when they join the UN, having frequently come from their own civil services. But Dan, please.
Thank you, Chair. Richard, earlier on you talked about rising tensions between the major actors in the UN, the major member states. How is that affecting political behaviour within the United Nations, and what do you think the UK can do to improve the situation facing, I think, the UN as a whole?
So when I referred to major power tensions, my specific main concern at the moment is Russia's positioning in the Security Council. In the first year after Russia's assault on Kiev, it was notable that actually the Russians were relatively pragmatic in the Security Council and tried to avoid getting into too many fights on issues unrelated to Ukraine. That has now changed, and we're seeing Russia using its veto more and more aggressively on matters ranging from humanitarian aid to Syria to the nuclear program of North Korea. And I do worry that Russia has gone through a strategic shift and is really aiming to challenge the West on a very systematic basis in the UN now. I'm less concerned about China in the Security Council. China in the Security Council remains relatively cautious, although it does flex its muscles at times. But I think the Russian challenge is the main one. I think that the UK, both in the Security Council, but more generally, does need to do what it can to rally the very significant number of countries that still want a working multilateral system. And I think that at a time when elements of the UN, like the Security Council, may become more paralyzed, so that may involve going to the General Assembly more often, as we have done over Ukraine, to rally support for UN mediation efforts, humanitarian efforts, and so forth. I do think that the UK still has the ability, as Lord Malloch-Brown was suggesting, to be a sort of ringleader for the good guys in the UN system, if it wishes to be, in the face of almost inevitably worsening great power tensions.
Henry, over to you.
Thank you very much. In this committee's report of 2021 on multilaterals, it identified intensifying attempts by autocratic states to capture multilateral organizations and subvert their principles and norms. Do you feel that trend has continued, and where is it having, in your view, Richard, most impact?
So I would be careful about the autocratic capture narrative. As I say, Russia is being hugely disruptive, but actually Russia doesn't have the resources or the influence to capture many parts of the UN system. It can block, but it actually cannot really control many parts of the UN. China has unquestionably gained a huge amount of influence over certain UN agencies, for example, the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. And China is very much shaping a lot of development debates in the UN system now, and it's also making its weight felt, as Emma can describe better than me, on human rights debates in Geneva. Even there, though, I would emphasize something of a positive. I think that Western countries have managed to push back against Chinese influence in the last 4 or 5 years. There's a much higher awareness of how China is trying to fill senior positions at the UN or insert Xi Jinping language into UN texts. I think until about 2020, China was able to expand its influence almost unchecked. Now there is more pushback. So yes, there is an autocratic challenge at the UN, but we have seen that it is also possible to monitor that and to counter that with persistent and focused diplomacy.
Thank you. What other states, apart from Russia and China, should the UK be concerned about, and what is driving some countries to support them?
As Lord Malloch-Brown said, the number of countries that persistently support Russia in particular is very small. I mean, and it is the Syrias and Venezuelas and Cubas of this world. And that block, I think, is pretty hard to break up. What I would say is that there is a much broader group of developing countries, many of them currently under a lot of economic pressure, that don't want to be forced to choose between the West and China. They want to get what they can from both sides in the divide. And there are a lot of countries that look to China for financial and economic reasons, even if they don't want to be part of a Chinese-led bloc. I think Lord Malloch-Brown was absolutely right to focus on the need to reform the international financial institutions so that they can help some of these developing countries deal with their debt issues and with their economic problems. Because if they see that they can work with the UK, the US, and the EU to deal with their economic challenges, then I think they will have a tendency to continue to cooperate with us through the UN. If we can't offer them those economic incentives, then they will have reasons to tilt further and further towards Beijing.
Thank you. Emma, what differences have you observed in the way states respond to and engage with the Secretariat and the rules of the UN? And how can senior officials realistically respond under that sort of pressure?
Well, I think what we have seen is an increasing interference, essentially, by UN member states. And basically, any time they know that someone at working level is sort of writing a mandated report that is going to potentially mention their country, you know, they will be on the phone every 5 minutes to that person. And then when you try to sort of engage with democratic member states, including the UK, the response that you get is, OHCHR is independent, we couldn't possibly interfere. Now, that would be fine if the autocratic member states were also playing by those rules. But, you know, I was assaulted in my office by a Cuban diplomat because he didn't like that Cuban Congos weren't going to be able to speak in the UPR of Cuba, for example. That wasn't an unusual circumstance. You would get quite senior diplomats coming and threatening relatively junior UN staff. You see it with things like when there's going to be a discussion on China in the Council, rules are broken, but to placate China. So the last time there was even a threat of discussion of the situation in Xinjiang, the rules of the entire UN office in Geneva were broken to allow a nice exhibit of what a wonderful, you know, it was called Xinjiang is a Wonderful Land. And all of the Uyghurs had to walk through this exhibit even to access the room. So it's that kind of constant low-level interference on basically everything to try to create a situation where it is so much work to deal with all of the notes for the file that are inevitably going to be generated by all, you know, once they've seen me and I've said no, they're going to go directly to the High Commissioner. I have to write the note for the file to the High Commissioner. We're going to have all of these meetings. So a lot of UN staff, frankly, more out of laziness than conviction, are just willing to essentially give in. It's easier. It'll make their lives easier. They can get on with what they're supposed to be doing. And I think also there's been an increasing sort of financial clout exercised by China in a way that isn't necessarily public, but they're getting a lot of bang for their buck. So there's this 20 million a year, essentially a slush fund that Lord Malloch-Brown referred to briefly. And 10 million a year of that goes to what I would call blue washing Belt and Road projects, where those Belt and Road projects then get a nice UN label that they can stick in them. So it's essentially development aid that China was always going to give, but now it goes via the UN and therefore is sort of sanctified in some way. And the other 10 million is essentially for the pet projects of the Secretary General that he can't get funded anywhere else. And, you know, China clearly feels it's getting something out of giving the Secretary General a 10 million slush fund. And there wasn't any member state discussion about the establishment of that. It's called the Peace and Development Trust Fund. There's no similar mechanism that exists for any other member state. So I think one issue to look at is, why did the UN decide to take money outside the sort of normal, regular budget voluntary contributions system? Another way that China tries to get its priorities into the Secretariat is through conditionalities that are never actually publicised on China's donations to the UN. So it doesn't give very much voluntary funding, but that it does give is quite heavily focused on the sort of small island developing states, SIDS, and least developing countries, LDCs. They just happen to make up the majority of the remaining member states that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And of course, a secret conditionality that is never published to the other member states is that these monies are not allowed to be dispersed to countries that do have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So if you want to access the UN funds, you then have to change allegiance and recognise China. And because other member states aren't informed of that, it means that they don't have the opportunity, for example, to make up any shortfall. All they see is, oh, that's fully funded, they have the full budget requirement they asked for, we can move on to the next thing. So it's that kind of complete lack of budget transparency, I think, that is also one of the issues that really needs to be looked at, ideally through the Fifth Committee.
My next question was going to be, can you give us some examples of how some countries are abusing the system? And you've just given several shocking examples there with regard to China, and your previous earlier one in terms of the whistleblowing that you undertook in terms of information being passed to China on human rights activists. You very articulately and clearly set out the issue. Why do you think states like the United States, the UK, others, France, in terms of another P5 member, why are we putting up with this sort of practice? Why are we allowing a 10 million slush fund for the Secretary General's pet projects to be delivered from one country? Is it because better somebody else is paying money towards the UN, or?
I mean, my answer is actually even worse. Negligence. There's a tendency not to look at why certain things are being proposed in the General Assembly. A lot of the stuff that is seen as administrative is just gavelled through. I mean, I have written these scripts for the presidents of meetings, sat next to them, they read what is put in front of them. So for just another example that I think is quite shocking is, and it is related to my own case, but I give it by way of a general example. After the hearings were held in my case, it was very clear that I was going to win against the UN. That would be a bad look. So the UN decided they needed to get rid of that judge quite quickly. So they brought forward the election of judges in the General Assembly by 6 months. The executive director of the Office of Administration of Justice stood up and, quite frankly, lied to the gathered General Assembly about what was happening. The judge who was removed and myself both made complaints about this. He was told he wasn't a UN staff member and therefore had no grounds to complain. I was told it was not in the interest of the organisation to conduct an investigation. They then essentially gavelled through the removal of a judge, having been lied to that this would have no financial consequences and the judges currently in place would finish the cases they had. The judge hearing my case turned up to work the next morning and was told he didn't have a job anymore. At the time of that vote, there was actually one of the other judges who was due to be removed was at the back of the room and was prevented by UN security from approaching member states to inform them of what was really going on. I mean, it is very difficult to overstate how corrupt the UN has become when it comes to things that it really wants to cover up. I'm even aware that the office of Melissa Fleming, the UN's head of communication, has been quite busy all weekend trying to encourage other participants not to participate in this meeting.
Thank you very much.
That's an interesting one, given that we had 2 people pull out claiming to be sick, but I'm sure they were. Can I ask quickly on that point about the Xinjiang genocide whitewashing exhibition? What member states opposed that and made a point or raised it in some sort of systemic way or bureaucratic manner to say that they opposed the fact that that was not only taking place, but the fact that it was taking place when it was, which was clearly an intimidatory tool?
The member states aren't informed in advance of the exhibitions at all. The internal process that should have been followed, and I used to be the person on the UN side of this, was that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the person responsible for exhibits, would work with Cultural Affairs in UNOG. Cultural Affairs were there to say, does this exhibit have artistic merit or not? And I or my colleagues who took over that role was there on the political side. The rule was we never had any exhibit that related to a country situation during the Human Rights Council. Never.
That rule was broken.
That rule was deliberately broken for China. It was broken by the same man who hands names to China. His name, well, he's now retired, but his name is Eric Tistone. He was the chief of the Human Rights Council branch.
And what should the UK have done that we didn't in response to, for example, an exhibition like that?
You should have gone immediately and had a meeting with the High Commissioner and demanded that the exhibit be removed and asked why an exception was being made for China.
We're not aware of any country having done that.
I'm not aware of any country doing it. I'm aware of a number that expressed concern amongst themselves. I know that it was brought up in an EU meeting, but I'm not aware of whether any further measures are taken because, frankly, they don't. There's a very deep lack of knowledge among diplomats from the UK and basically every other democracy as to what the internal rules are. I mean, they don't know that that's the actual rule. And given that Eric Tistone has admitted that he lied to the UK delegation about handing names of UK citizens to China, I don't think he would have had any compunction about saying, oh yes, it's terrible, we couldn't possibly have done anything.
What's the accountability for the fact that he admitted lying to the UK delegation?
Absolutely nothing.
The UK didn't respond to that either?
No, I did inform them.
Brendan, you
just very quickly, point of clarity.
Mm-hmm.
When exactly did this happen and where?
The exhibition.
The exhibition, there were actually three. The one I was referring to was around it was when the US was putting forward a resolution that they should have a debate on the Xinjiang resolution. I can get you the exact dates afterwards. It would take me 5 minutes online.
You say it happened 3 times?
Yeah, there were 3 exhibits in total.
3 of the same exhibits?
Yeah, vaunting China's human rights record in Xinjiang.
If you could let us know when and where
I will write down exactly when they happened.
Great, thank you.
And just a quick one, Emma, obviously I make the point to Richard about it's difficult to believe that when some people join an international multilateral organisation, they truly put to one side their country affiliation. Now, I would like to say there are exceptional diplomats around the world who do exactly that, and they join a multilateral organisation and they put to one side any domestic affiliation or interest they have. However, it is difficult when you see certain countries surging people into the UN. It is difficult when you look at how people are raised in certain countries to believe certain revisionist histories, that therefore when they go into the UN they suddenly adopt a globalist view of it, which is, to Richard's point, this is not a club of democracies, but ultimately it is there supposedly to support some of those ambitions and values. What accountability is there within the system to make sure that individuals are working in that country agnostic way that they should be?
0. Absolutely nothing. There was supposed to be after the World Summit in 2005. That created the court system, the investigation system, and the ethics system. I actually brought with me a set of memos that were exchanged in my own case. And I bring those because the General Assembly at one point ordered an audit of all of those accountability systems. I was interviewed as part of that audit in July 2020. I was told by the auditors that their intention was to use my case as the main case showing how none of the systems work. The auditors, purportedly independent, were then called by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and told to remove any examples. So the report that was received by member states was entirely based on interviews with senior managers. I have the memos that were exchanged in my case. I just want to make sure I'm listing exactly the people. These were exchanged amongst the Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Head of Management, Catherine Pollard, the Head of Ethics, Elia Armstrong, the Head of Investigation, Fatima Ndiaye, her Deputy, Ben Swanson, the Head of Legal Affairs, Suarpo Suarez, the Head of Human Resources, Marta Helena Lopez. Those are the people who actually run the UN Secretariat, and it's a fairly inclusive group. All of those people exchanged a series of memos discussing exactly how they were not going to apply the rules in my case, how they would get away with it, in order to ensure that there was never any investigation of the UN's relationship with China. It is at that level. And those are the people that UK diplomats meet with. So when UK diplomats meet with them, they are told all kinds of horrible things about me, so they won't meet me. But at one point, the head of ethics, in a memo written directly to the Secretary General, tells him a failure to investigate will have detrimental consequences for the reputation of the organisation, so that's priority one, and the Secretary General's stated commitment to protection against retaliation, as well as erode staff confidence that the policy is effective. And she is completely right. I have had an Assistant Secretary General come to me to tell me that he was not going to report child rape by someone under his supervision because he knew, based on what he had seen the UN do to me, that there was absolutely no chance that the perpetrator would suffer any consequences, but that he was absolutely certain to lose his job for speaking up. I mean, you cannot have a system where every purported guarantee of independence is reporting to one of those people. And that is the current system that you have. What you need to do is exactly what the UN does across the world. It's what I was trained to do. It was the bits of the UN that did work. I was an expert in the rule of law. You set up separate systems, reporting directly to the General Assembly in the same way, for example, OIOS purportedly already does, so it's very easy to reform that one first. They report directly to the General Assembly. You get rid of everyone that currently works in those institutions, and you hire people with 7-year non-renewable contracts, where neither they nor their families can immediately walk into cushy UN jobs afterwards. It's not actually difficult to solve this, but it does desperately need to be solved. The problem is not that there are these sort of angels working in UN offices that are being unfairly maligned because of great power conflicts in the sort of rooms of the Security Council. It is the single most corrupt place I've ever worked, and it should be so much better.
So Richard, does this ring true to you? Does it ring fair to you? Where do we go from here if this is the state of things?
I would say that in my experience, many UN officials are actually quite dedicated people, and many UN officials are not, do not live up to the sort of very negative characterization that you're hearing from Emma. But I think Emma herself said that there are good people in the UN system too. Yeah. I do think that we should keep in mind that we're also talking about an organization that sends people to work in very, very hard places, such as the Central African Republic, and sometimes do dangerous things and sometimes lose their lives. And I think that is worthy of respect, but it is obviously also true that any institution requires scrutiny, and the UN certainly does require scrutiny. I think that there is currently very low morale in the UN Secretariat. I think that even some of the finest UN officials I know feel very worn down because they're seeing a lot of the norms that they thought they were going to work to achieve eroding quite rapidly globally. And I do think that, in the words of one friend at the UN, there is quite a lot of quiet quitting going on. There are quite a lot of people who are, not pulling their weight in the organisation because they're not quite sure what the organisation is for anymore. I do think it's worth highlighting that there is an opportunity for change coming up with the selection of a new Secretary General. The selection of a new Secretary General comes around in 2026, and that will be an opportunity to look for someone who can put some life back into the organisation. It's also traditionally true that Secretaries General have 10-year terms, but they normally do most of their institutional reforms in the first 2 or 3 years that they're in office. That's when they have the most political capital. So I think, there are a lot of big institutional questions facing the UN at the moment. They're not only about human resources, they're not only about accountability. I think we also need to look very seriously, for example, at what has gone wrong in some big UN peacekeeping operations, such as the one in Mali, which closed last year. But I do think that the UK should invest quite heavily in finding us an impressive new Secretary General who can maybe kick down some doors and change some rules, because it is an opportunity that only comes around once a decade in most cases.
Thank you, Fabian.
Richard, you mentioned there the failed peacekeeping mission to Mali, but what about Haiti? What went wrong there?
Haiti is one of the countries where the UN has been most frequently deployed in the last 30 years. The UN has been pushing for a deployment to Haiti, but does not want to send blue helmets of its own, because when there were last blue helmets in the country, a Nepali unit almost certainly introduced cholera into Haiti. And if you want to talk about the history of UN cover-ups...
Richard, we couldn't hear you. Introduced what?
Cholera.
Cholera. Yeah. Yes, you're right.
If you want to talk about the history of UN cover-ups, there was certainly a huge cover-up over that. So what the Security Council has been trying to do, and this is one area of reasonable cooperation, is find an alternative peacekeeping force for Haiti. Kenya offered police last year. Some other African countries and Caribbean countries offered police and troops. The problem is that the process of getting this force together was very slow. There wasn't really a political track for getting acceptance for this force in Haiti. And now the main gangs in Port-au-Prince have seized control of the city and will almost certainly resist any international deployment violently. I'm afraid it's a case where the politics of getting agreement on a peacekeeping operation was so extended that there probably will not be a peace operation of the type that was intended.
The UN is prepared, or unwillingly prepared, to allow the permanent chaos in Haiti, especially in Port-au-Prince at the moment, because it is unbelievable what's going on there, and nobody seems to care.
It is a dreadful situation. I think that if you start to get very large-scale refugee outflows, then the US and Caribbean countries will probably push for some sort of action. It is possible that you end up with another Blue Helmet force going in for the want of any other alternatives. But I think it's now fairly clear that you would need a pretty heavy force that is capable of, frankly, urban combat with some very well-armed gangs. And that is not what has been on the table so far.
I'll leave it there, Richard.
Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Richard, thinking about UK values and interests, where within the UN system are we most valued? Can we have most impact? And can we build on the work that we do?
I mean, let me say that certainly in New York, and I believe also in Geneva and Vienna, you have very good representation. And certainly Barbara Woodward, the permanent representative in New York, is a very highly respected diplomat amongst her peers. I hear that very frequently. And UK diplomats are good at drafting things. They are good at writing resolutions. They are good at managing UN process. And so in the Security Council, for example, other council members do sometimes complain that the UK is too close to the US on certain issues, but there's nonetheless an appreciation for the fact that the UK is a constructive and well-informed member of the Council. Looking beyond the Security Council, I think we have to be honest that for a long time, the UK was also valued as a great leader on international development. And the member of the P5 that was also most articulate and thoughtful about international development. The decision to get rid of the 0.7% pledge, the reduction of UK aid, did do some significant damage, I think, to the UK's presence and influence in New York. But I do notice now with your current ministers at the FCDO, there is a sense that the UK is grappling with that problem. And I do think that going forward, even if getting back to 0.7% is probably not politically realistic, the UK should continue to aim to work as a leader on development, debt, and some of the other economic issues I raised as being of great significance to a lot of other UN member states. I do work in New York. I don't work in Geneva. I have heard from colleagues who work in Geneva that in diplomatic terms, the UK is still very effective around the Human Rights Council, that again, as it knows the procedures and art of Security Council diplomacy, it's also good in the Human Rights Council, but that is part of the UN world that I know less well. But I would really emphasize that the development piece of the puzzle is one that requires care and investment, because it is a major source of influence for the UK when done right.
Okay. I mean, you've given us a few ways in which the UK government can strengthen its relationship with the UN. I wonder, looking ahead to the Summit of the Future, are there anything specifically you hope UK ministers will pursue there?
So I think we should set our expectations fairly low for the Summit of the Future. The Summit of the Future is going to agree a pact for the future, but that has to be agreed by consensus. And you can imagine that getting consensus on almost any policy area at the UN is extraordinarily hard. My reading of what matters most about the summit is, firstly, the developing countries do want to see some sort of signs of progress. Again, on the issues that I'm banging on about, the issues of debt and the issues of financing. That for them is the litmus test of whether this summit is successful. I think the other area where the summit can play a significant role is in starting to sketch out an international architecture for cooperation and eventually regulation around artificial intelligence and some other rapidly developing technologies. That is an issue which 3 or 4 years ago was not discussed at the UN at all. Now it is suddenly a huge focus. The US just tabled and got consensus for a General Assembly resolution on the need to use AI for development. The UK held a Security Council session on AI last year. There was also the UK AI Summit. Again, this is an area where I think a lot of member states don't have a lot of knowledge and are quite happy to see countries like the UK sort of advancing a multilateral agenda. So in essence, I would say development and tech. I'm afraid that on such unicorns as Security Council reform, we are not going to see a lot of progress in September. The politics are just too hard. And I think that given the tensions amongst the major powers that we've touched on a lot, there's going to be very little on security in the Summit of the Future. And I do think that is a worrying sign about where things stand at the UN.
Can I just follow up?
Graham and then Fabian.
Richard, on AI, I'm interested in what you said about AI. I don't quite understand what you're saying the UN role will be. At the present time, Europe has got a very detailed and complex regulatory system on its way, almost re-regulating every year. The Americans seem content. We've got all the big tech companies. We'll let them deal with it. It's two very different systems. I don't quite understand what you see as the role in regulating AI from the UN.
Well, let me say immediately that I am not an expert on AI myself. And
it was interesting what you said.
Nor will I ever be. But I think that, Secretary General Guterres has suggested the creation of a standalone multilateral agency that would oversee the regulation of AI, modeled on the IAEA and the way that it regulates Nuclear technologies. I'm afraid that I don't think very many people think that is realistic or even desirable at this stage. I think that it could end up just being the process of building an institution for its own sake. Where I think the UN does have a role is probably on sort of working on ways to spread the advantages of AI, helping poorer nations have access to new technologies. That is a focus for the Summit of the Future. Secondly, in the arms control space, I don't think we're going to get hard treaties on the use of AI in conflict, but the UN can be a venue for discussions of the guidelines that should relate to the use of AI in conflict, although those sort of talks are always quite painful and quite opaque. And lastly, I think that the UN, can also. I mean, actually, this is really a part of the first thing I pointed to. The UN can be a source of information. It can be a source of guidance to a very large number of states and governments that don't understand this technology, that worry about how technological change may affect them. And I think that this is an area where the UN can be a useful, impartial provider of information. And organizations like Microsoft have been setting up liaison offices around the UN because they do want to influence the way the organization develops. So they clearly do see some value in multilateral cooperation, at least on these areas.
Thank you.
Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Richard, you touched on reform of the UN Security Council in response to my colleague Dan Carden earlier. And the UK has, to an extent, led the way. I'm not trying to pull the rug from under the next question, but I just wanted to ask you about the fact that the world has changed beyond recognition since 1945, and the settlement of 1945 created the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Now, I accept what you say, that without their agreement, nothing can change, and why would they agree to remove themselves? That's not going to happen. But surely the UN has to recognise the fact that countries like Brazil are growing economies and powers in the world. India, for example, its economy growing hugely. South Africa, which has massive potential. And that's just to name 3. Turkey, for example, which, although its economy is floundering a bit at the moment, is providing leadership in its region. We may not like some of the things it does, but it's providing that leadership and a very important role. Surely those countries deserve to play a greater role within the UN Security Council as well as the General Assembly. Would you not agree?
I would fully agree. And the fact that there has been so little progress, or frankly, no real progress on Security Council reform has, I think, affected the way that some of these countries view the UN. As I said at the outset, I've covered the organization for 20 years, and I have noticed over that time that India is increasingly less interested in the organization, because I think that despite their public rhetoric, Indian officials recognize that they won't get a permanent seat in the Security Council. And so India is investing more in the G20, in the Quad, in other arrangements away from the UN, because it sees that it can actually project its power and gain influence through those instead. I think if we don't have...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Carry on.
I think if we don't have UN reform, Brazil and others will go the same way. The basic issue is that there is one member of the P5, China, that is profoundly opposed to the idea that Japan or India should gain permanent seats in the Security Council. And while the US has recently become more positive about Security Council reform, China continues to push back. And this makes getting reform very, very hard indeed.
Would that not increasingly make it pointless for countries like China to try and dominate the UN if the UN becomes increasingly irrelevant to those growing powers in the world, those growing economies?
I think this is something which affected the Biden administration's view on this, and one reason why Biden did call for Security Council reform. I mean, it was partially a response to Russia's actions over Ukraine, but it was also a recognition that this is a wasting asset. It's a wasting asset for the US. It's a wasting asset for us, because us being the UK, because we do see, as Lord Malloch-Brown said, countries drifting away from the UN. We're even now seeing a very striking tendency for African countries to push back against the Security Council, to try to keep the Security Council out of their affairs, to weaken UN sanctions regimes. And there is a sense that, the world is drifting away from the Security Council. And as a result, the Council, having a permanent seat and a veto on the Council matters less. However, it is still very hard to persuade the current veto powers to be rational about this and agree to share some power to keep the organisation relevant.
Thank you, Chair. Just further to that point, beyond China, is there a desire among any of the other permanent members to even discuss change? And is there even a mechanism for change in the Security Council?
So, there is a desire. France and the UK have, at least in public, supported change for a long time. As I say, the Biden administration took an unusual step by doing active outreach to see if there was a way to get change in 2022 and 2023. The Russians say they're open to reform, but only on terms that would favour them. So Germany and Japan have long wanted permanent seats. Russia will never accept that. They would probably accept India and Brazil because they think those countries are more congenial. There's a huge amount of discussion about this in the wider UN membership. It is a very hot topic amongst ambassadors in New York. And there is a mechanism. It's called the Intergovernmental Negotiations on Security Council Reform that has been meeting and has been talking about different models of reform. We're not failing to progress because of any lack of diplomatic activity. There's a great deal of discussion. But this does not change the political fundamentals, which is, firstly, as I say, China is opposed. And then, of course, there are other tensions. Brazil would like a permanent seat. Mexico and Argentina are very firmly opposed to that. Italy is very opposed to Germany getting a permanent seat. The politics are complex. We're not seeing real progress in the negotiations in terms of countries changing their positions. We're just seeing people restating their positions more and more frequently.
I just wonder then, in the Intergovernmental Council, do those who have the veto, the Security Council, have a veto on the Intergovernmental Council as well?
So to reform the Security Council, you need to reform the UN Charter. And to reform the UN Charter, you need the ratifications of 2/3 of the membership and all 5 current permanent members. So that in computer terms, it's the end of level guardian. At the end of the day, all of the UN's members could agree to charter change, but if one of the permanent 5 does not agree to it, then it cannot go through. It's also worth saying that even if the US were to negotiate reforms to the Security Council, right now it's very hard to see Congress ratifying that. So there are sort of deep-seated political obstacles that are above the pay grade, frankly, of even the best diplomats in New York.
So I would be correct in saying that if you have a veto now, you have a veto to stop any kind of change or any kind of development. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Emma, so beyond the Security Council, what other reforms should we be pressing for or looking at to make the UN fairer and more transparent? And would it be possible for the UK to lead or be part of building a coalition to make that happen?
Absolutely. I think that a lot of what we've discussed around the kind of complete lack of accountability, that's something where, as Richard said, the UK is seen as an excellent drafter. It's seen as excellent on the rule of law. I've seen other member states ask the UN to sort of look at, pre-zero drafts to make sure that their rule of law wording is correct. And I think it's really important as well, especially, whatever your views on the issue, post-Brexit, in many of the areas where there used to be burden sharing across the EU, the UK is limited in what it can currently follow. And I think you kind of have to look at what would be sort of ideally desirable. We all want to see Security Council reform, but it's not going to happen, versus what's attainable. And just going back to the Summit for the Future document, I mean, this is the summit kind of follows on from the 2005 World Summit, where they created all of these accountability mechanisms. Now, certainly putting in that same language, but just switching it slightly to make those genuinely independent would be something very attainable indeed. And in terms of coalition building, I don't know if you're aware, but on the Thursday of last week, the US House Foreign Affairs Committee had a hearing on a very similar topic. It was specifically looking at China's influence on the UN. And around half of that hearing was actually devoted to talking about the need for reform of the security, or for the reform of the Secretariat itself, to make the Secretariat more accountable. So I think that there's a general recognition among member states that there are quite serious problems in the Secretariat, that they're not getting truthful, accurate, or timely information when things go wrong, and that they need to sort of improve that. There's all kinds of existing recommendations on which that could be based. For example, David Kay, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, wrote several reports between 2015 and 2017 about specific tangible reforms that needed to be made to basically have freedom of information within the UN, at minimum subject access requests, to improve the systems of investigation and to improve whistleblower protection. And that's one of the UN's own appointed experts saying this needs to happen, and there was no follow-up. I think the UK could become much more active in the Sixth Committee. If you look at the membership of that committee, it's not taken terribly seriously by member states. It's where all of the kind of legal affairs are dealt with, including all of the sort of internal governance of the Secretariat. I think having a state with the rule of law chops of the UK in there on a regular basis, actually looking through and reading, would be helpful. For example, that's the committee that received a report from the UNDT, the Dispute Tribunal, where 8 out of 9 of the Dispute Tribunal judges said the president of this tribunal is not independent, she's taking instructions from the UN, she is not to be trusted. And nobody acted on that. Well, the UN acted on it, they got rid of the other 8 judges and kept her. But yeah, was that the correct reaction? But again, it's a lot of that stuff that seems like it should be beneath the influence, the radar of diplomats. And I mean, I agree. In an ideal world, it should. We should have sorted this stuff out. But so should whether or not an NGO can attend a meeting of the Human Rights Council. But that's not a given either. So I think it is very necessary to get into the nitty-gritty. There's a huge sort of knowledge among the diplomats and the main donors to the UN that this needs to happen, but nobody wants to do it, essentially. You can have a very cozy relationship with your friends at the UN until you start telling them that you want them to reform the way they want to do things. I think it's a more uncomfortable thing for a diplomat than going head to head on a substantive political issue of geopolitical sort of significance, but I think it is very, very necessary.
I think you've partly answered the questions I'm going to ask, but you've blown the whistle pretty loudly on malpractice. What is the impact of that malpractice on the effectiveness of the UN and politically on the UN? And I think you've approached the answer to this question, but I'll ask it explicitly. What reforms would you suggest?
I think what needs to underline reforms is accountability of individual staff members. It's something that kind of permeates national systems but is completely absent in the UN. If a staff member in the UN commits wrongdoing, that staff member, there is no way to hold that individual staff member accountable unless there is a decision by the Secretary General that want to, which never is. So when, for example, the head of investigations doesn't do his job, it's the whistleblower who's come forward to report wrongdoing that suffers. Similarly, when the head of ethics doesn't do her job. So I think there's a need to make a system where there is actual consequences on the individuals who commit wrongdoing, because all of this is underlined by the problem of diplomatic immunity, where even when crimes are committed by the UN, for example, against a whistleblower coming forward, there's absolutely no recourse for that person. So, I mean, at one point in my own case, the UN literally swatted me. They sent armed police to my home. It was during COVID and we were all working from home, so that I could not participate in a meeting and could not say any of what I've said today. I have absolutely no recourse because everyone involved has diplomatic immunity. So in a circumstance where someone commits misconduct, they face absolutely no personal consequence. Even when there's a judgment, and I've won several judgments in these courts, even though they find sort of 95% of the time for the administration. Even in those judgments, when I'm awarded compensation for someone harassing me, but the person who did the harassment faces no consequences. All that happens is that a little bit more of the UN coffers are spent on retaliating against me. Now, that's not my aim in taking those cases. It's about changing systems going forward. So review the package that created the UN Dispute Tribunal and the UN Appeals Tribunal, and make clear that hiring decisions within those must be made by the judges, not by the UN staff members. I would strongly recommend on that you speak to Rowan Downing. He is the judge who was fired from my case. I have it on good authority. He retires at the end of the month, which would free him to speak to you. On OIOS, it technically already reports to the General Assembly. There is something called the IAAC, which is supposed to oversee the investigation. Strengthen that. Put forward a UK member for that. Try to get good people on there who understand what it is they're looking at and will not just gavel through whatever is put in front of them by the UN. On the abuse of authority policy, at absolute minimum, undo the last reform, where instead of having to conduct an investigation where there's reasonable grounds to believe misconduct might occur, they now can decide based entirely in the interests of the organisation. So a lot of those more recent reforms can be undone essentially immediately. I've put a list of some extra reforms in my written evidence, which I would be happy to expand upon, to be honest. There's a lot more that can be done. But I think what's really important to remember is that while Security Council reform is a sort of pipe dream, because it would require agreement of so many, this is about saying there's this existing General Assembly resolution that is not being applied. And here's a list of the ways in which it's not being applied. And we require changes to the Secretary General's bulletin or the administrative instruction of the Secretariat that is purported to give action to what the Member States passed, but is actually undermining that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have slightly overrun, but Richard, is there anything to conclude that you'd like to add on reform, and then we'll finish for the day?
No, I think just on a different tack, coming back to some of the discussion we had touching on Haiti, I think that, for the last 25 years, despite many flaws, UN peace operations have been an important part of international peace and security, especially in Africa, but not only in Africa. And, it's still today peacekeepers in southern Lebanon are playing quite a significant role, sort of monitoring the situation in the Middle East. I think that it is now time for some sort of review of how peace operations work, how the UN can work better with other organizations like the African Union when they need to cooperate on peace operations. At the moment, there's a bit of a crisis of confidence in peacekeeping. I think, Chair, that you referred to it in your very first remarks. But we shouldn't give up on multilateral peacekeeping altogether. But I think we need to stop and think hard about how we do these operations better in a very difficult global environment. I do actually think this is a small thing which the Summit of the Future will endorse, the idea of some sort of review of peace operations. And I would take it seriously because it is one of the concrete ways that the UN actually does good when it can.
Well, thank you ever so much. It's a positive end on a hope that we can do that. So thank you both ever so much for your evidence. And with that, I suspend order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.